Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we get started, I've got two quick items. Number one, as usual, I want to thank some brand new Patreon supporters. Stacy Curry, Christopher Canfield, Jason Osterman, and Mona and Jim Dowding. These 5 folks signed up via Patreon, which is monthly support, and I greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate it. I appreciate all these folks, and I appreciate everybody who's supported the podcast over the years. And the second item is, if you want to support the podcast, but you're not interested in supporting financially, the absolute best thing you can do is to share the podcast with a friend. You could tell somebody about it. You could send them an email. You could share it on social media. Whatever you need to do just to spread the word, because I have never once spent money on advertising or on a publicist. The entire podcast has grown all because of word of mouth. And so for everybody out there who has shared it, I greatly appreciate it. And if you are enjoying it and know of a few of your buddies who may enjoy listening as well, please send it their way. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain Prairie podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Mark Kenyon. Mark is an author, podcaster, conservationist, and member of the MeatEater crew. You probably know him from his excellent book, That Wild Country, an epic journey through the past, present, and future of America's public lands. Or possibly from the Wired to Hunt podcast, or from his contributions to MeatEater's Netflix show and their other video productions. To learn more about Mark and his impressive personal and professional journey, I'd encourage you to go back to our first Mountain Prairie conversation from a few years ago, which is linked in the episode notes. In this episode, Mark and I are doing something a little different. We're focusing exclusively on books. Earlier this year, Mark had me on his podcast to talk about our favorite books about conservation, and we both received excellent feedback on that episode. You can find a link to that discussion in the episode notes. So we decided to have another book conversation, this time focusing on some of our favorite books about the American West. Both Mark and I are voracious readers who share a love of history, conservation, and adventure. So I'm always excited to hear Mark's recommendations and thoughts on a wide range of titles. The episode starts out with a brief catch-up on Mark's summer adventures and his current work with MeatEater, and then we dive straight into the books. We each pick 5 of our all-time favorites to talk about, and as you'd expect, we veer off into lots of tangentially related titles and subjects. This is an episode where you'll definitely want to check out the episode notes, because they're links to dozens of books, authors, films, and other resources. Mark and I could have easily talked for 3 or 4 hours, but we had to keep the conversation relatively short because of our tight schedules. However, we're going to try and make these book conversations a regular occurrence on both of our podcasts. So if you like this format, stay tuned for more. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to check out Mark's podcast or follow him on social media. He's a smart, thoughtful, hardworking guy that brings tons of value to the world of conservation and outdoor recreation. Please enjoy this episode, and if you do, please share it with a few friends. Thanks a lot. Mr. Mark Kenyon, we had such a fun conversation last time we talked on your podcast, and I didn't really give you the full extent of it, but I was pretty damn sick. We did that, and I drank a bunch of Jocko energy drink and got all jacked up, and so I think I made enough sense because I've gotten some nice comments about that, probably all because of you. But I really enjoyed it, and I love just your book recommendations, and I love everything you're doing. So I'm super pumped that we get the chance to talk again. But before we get in the books, I had 2 questions for you.
Yeah.
One is, how was your summer out west with your family? Because we got families about the same age, and I'm seeing you getting a lot of big fish on Instagram. And then what do you have coming up with MeatEater in the fall? Because I'm catching you right before the tidal wave of hunting season hits you.
Yes, it's about to get wild. But yeah, the summer was great. As you know, we have a cabin in Idaho, and we spend as much of the year there that we can. It's usually about 3-4 months. And so we just have come back to Michigan after a really great spring and summer out there. The boys are 2 and 4 now, and they are just eating it all up. I mean, they are diehard outdoors kids. So we spent a ton of time on the water. It was definitely a water year. At those ages, at least, the things that they've, both been the most excited about and the things that ended up being like the most doable, given their ages and stuff, ended up being water activities. So the big, I'd say, like paradigm shift was that my oldest, Everett, who's 4, has caught on how to catch stuff. Like, he is now fast enough, coordinated enough, strategic enough that he can catch critters, and he has become obsessed. So he will literally, Ed, I'm not kidding here, we, for example, camp next to a river, and he would sit on the edge of that river for 4 hours straight, doing nothing but trying to catch minnows and frogs. And he has focus, an unbelievable level of focus and dedication. So yeah, really fun. I mean, he caught his first minnows on his own, and then became like a savant with minnows. He's caught thousands of minnows now. Caught his first frog with his hands, and then got really into that, catching lots of frogs. Found his first crayfish, was catching crayfish. He was even catching some big, like sculpin, like big bottom feeder fish. Was catching those. And then throughout the year, he's been practicing with his fly rod, and he had a couple close calls. At one point, he had a nice cutthroat that hooked onto a nymph that he was kind of swinging through a hole, and then he was reeling it in, and I was so excited and hooting and hollering, and he was hooting and hollering, and then just in the middle of the fight, he just stopped and just started walking away, and I didn't know what he was doing, and I'm like, you gotta keep reeling it in. I'm like hollering at him, and he just ignores me, just starts walking away, and I was so confused. And then after the fish got off, and he said, well, he was standing on a rock, and he said, I didn't feel stable on the rock, Dad, so before I could do anything else, I had to get stable again. And so that led to him losing that fish. But like a month later, we were out on a float on another river, and he ended up hooking and landing his first fish on a fly, and it was on a dry fly, actually. So it was very cool, like 100% on his own. So he was casting on his own, watching it. He's not really mending yet, but he was. Yeah. We were in a spot where there was a good riffle, and it was the evening hatch, and the fish were going crazy, and he just kept chucking it out there, letting it drift through this hole, and he got exploded on like 20 times and never could set it. But finally, one fish was eager enough that he stuck around, and we landed his first little rainbow. And so that was a huge victory.
That's a big deal, man. I mean,
it was cool.
I can't imagine that. My oldest daughter has caught some bass, on a like largemouth down at this ranch on a spinning rod, and that was so cool. But the idea of catching a trout on a dry fly as a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
I mean, how cool is that? Super dad. You're super dad. Putting these guys in this. I mean, think about having that kind of opportunity, like when you're a little kid, to do that. I mean, he won't even remember that. It's like I met this guy who's a really good surfer, and he'd been surfing. He said, I don't remember catching my first wave. I just remember knowing how to surf. Mm-hmm. And that's how your son's going to be with catching fish. He just knows how to do it. It's pretty cool, man.
Yeah, they definitely have a way earlier start than I did, and a lot better training. I was, my family I grew up in was outdoors, like domestic outdoors people. And so, we would do some very light outdoor things, which was fun. Like, that gave me the entryway, but obviously I've gotten really, really deep into it, and the boys now have seemingly been sharing that interest. And so it's been a ton of fun. They love the fishing. They love playing in the water. We did stand-up paddleboarding, and, as you know, I'm a big hunter. And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff within our world. And so the boys now like to pretend to be Dad, or pretend to be Steve Ranella, or pretend to be Giannis Patelis, and do little pretend hunts all the time. So that's another thing, is my son will go, and he's got a little like pretend Lego gun, or is a little bow he has, and he will use that and go on these whole make-believe hunts and spend hours with it. He actually pretended he was hunting pronghorn. We were camping in a national forest once, and there was a herd of pronghorn that came off in the distance, and he said, Dad, I gotta go get those pronghorn. So I said, all right, buddy, good luck. And he took off, and I kind of followed behind him in the distance, watching him and encouraging him. And he went sneaking along. He did the whole thing. I mean, crawling on all fours, and he kept on checking the wind and pulling up his binos. And then he got to where he had a good shot, and then all of a sudden I hear him say, kapow, kapow. So, yeah, it's fun times, and I'm just thankful that there's a lot of great wild places we can explore out there with them and share with those boys. And, like you said, they might not remember the specifics, but I hope it fosters in them a love and a foundation for them to grow from.
Oh yeah. It's in their foundation. It's in their operating system, like it's just how they are now. And, I think whether you're into hunting, fishing, or whatever, I see it in my daughters and in other activities, but especially my oldest, I'm very proud that she can focus for hours on end, because I feel like everything in society is trying to counteract that, with the iPads and all the information. And so like when I see her sitting there reading a book for an hour, it makes me happy, but it's also like a sense of relief. Like, all right, we're fending off Zuckerberg and company for the moment.
I 100% agree. I think the outdoors is, in whatever flavor of outdoor activity you like, I think the outdoors is the greatest antidote to so many of our modern day woes. I mean, like you said, there's so many crazy things out there, and I know no better solution than to get outside and away from it all.
Well, you're setting a good example, and when I see you on your stuff on social media, it makes me happy, and it's in a way instructive and reinforcing for me. And sometimes I get so frustrated with social media, but your stuff's always. I think because we're in the same stage of life, even though I'm an old man compared to you. I love it. So what's coming up? What do you got? I just found out before we started recording that I caught you at the last moment before the whirlwind.
Yeah. So a pretty good travel slate of trips this coming fall. I've got like a work trip here starting this coming week, a big kind of MeatEater get together, and then I'm actually doing a backcountry fly fishing trip with a few buddies right after that. So I'm excited for that one.
Nice.
I almost never get to do fishing trips. Usually when I'm fishing, it's, just with the family, little day kind of outings. But in this case, I was able to tack a few days onto this other work thing. So that'll be fun, kind of change of pace. And then the rest of the fall for my various projects with MeatEater, I'll be hunting in Idaho, North Dakota, Nebraska, Texas, and then here at home in Michigan and maybe Ohio too. So a bunch of trips, doing a lot of different public land things, hopefully telling some stories about some interesting hunts, some beautiful landscapes. Definitely want to explore some of the issues around these various public landscapes as well. That's a goal of mine more and more, is to dive into, not just a fun trip you can have, but also what it took for us to have these special places and wildlife there as well. So I'll be doing stories around some of those different things across my platforms, and hopefully, spend a lot of nights under the stars.
Can you believe that's your job? Like I think when me and you, when we first connected on the podcast, when your book came out, which is an awesome book, by the way, I'm going to keep pushing that book.
Thank you.
That Wild Country. I'm staring at it right here. I think you had just joined MeatEater, and you've been doing it on your own for a long time and built it up, which I so admire how you built up just from the business side of things. But like, is it just still kind of crazy to you that when you list off all these cool places you're going, that is your job?
It is crazy. I'll go through kind of ebbs and flows of appreciation for it. There'll be periods of time where I'll be so in the weeds of the work and all the stuff that goes into it that I will take it for granted sometimes, or I'll get burnout. Like any job, you have those types of moments and those days or periods, but I will frequently have to pinch myself and remind myself to like take a step back and realize how unreal this is, how fortunate I am to be able to do that. So there's periods like that, and then there's other periods of just pure bliss where it's like, gosh, this is the best thing. And then those are the moments where you're like, geez, this is just you got to soak it all in, soak this in, because A, nothing's guaranteed forever. B, this is something that a lot of people would love to be able to experience, and I just better make something good out of it. I keep on reminding myself that you better make this worth it. You better do whatever's necessary to give back, or to fulfill the responsibility, or to make good on the investment of whatever good fortune I've had. I got to make sure to give back equal or more. So I feel that often too.
Well, for people listening, I'll have a link to our first episode, which, I mean, that might have been like 4 years ago now.
That's crazy.
Crazy. For people who want to hear more about Mark's, how he built his initial business that eventually led him to MeatEater, it's really inspiring no matter what you're doing from a creative standpoint. Because, I mean, you focused in and you busted your ass and you worked extremely hard and you made it happen. And I think it's whether you're into art or conservation or anything that requires kind of an entrepreneurial mix with creativity, I think you are a great template for people to follow. I mean, I've followed it and I just really admire it. So people should go back and listen to that. But for now, let's talk about some books, because on our first, when you were so nice to have me on to talk about books on your podcast, Wired to Hunt, we talked about we each picked 5 conservation books that were important to us. And it's so hard to pick them. But
it really
I was thinking for this one, both you and I are not from the American West initially, but we've kind of settled out here in different ways and have a great appreciation for it. And we both love to read. And so I was thinking we'd talk about 5 of our favorite books about the American West each. And then when I sent you that text, and then I started thinking about it, I was like, man, I don't even know what my 5 favorite are. It's so
really
hard
struggled.
because sometimes they're different ones, like Blood and Thunder, which is one of the ones I want to discuss. That might be my favorite when I'm driving down I-25 from where I live in Colorado Springs to Santa Fe, and you're driving through Las Vegas and all these places that are mentioned in the book. Or like if I'm up in Missoula, all of a sudden I really appreciate reading Undaunted Courage about Lewis and Clark. And so the way I started thinking about the books that I picked at least, are just books that all the ones I picked are history books in one way or another, but I really like all of them because they link me to the current present day in one way or another. And I think all history books do that to a point, but these books lay this very foundational groundwork about the American West that I can draw a direct line from where we are now in one way or another back to this foundation and understand better why we're here.
Yeah.
And then kind of another theme of the books I picked is just books in general. I like that they're launching points. You read it and it opens your eyes to about 20 new books that you want to read, 20 new subjects. And it is kind of like the center of a wheel, and there are all these spokes that come off. And so I don't know that I can say that the ones I picked are my all-time favorites, just because I have a hard time doing that. But they're just books that have been important to me in my understanding of the West. And so just wanted to kind of give that heads up from my end. But since you are the guest, I would love for you to go first and just talk about the first book. When you think about the American West and good books you've read, what's the first one that comes to mind?
Yeah. Well, I'll first add, it's funny, I didn't think about this coming into like my planning for what books I would select, but I kind of fell into the same theme as you did, as mostly Western history focused. And I wonder if that's not coincidence. I wonder if the best books about the West, or at least for people like you and me, are those books that ground us in the history of a place, because it makes our experiences in these places that much richer. I find so many times that I'll be out on a hike, or like you said, driving down the road somewhere, and I will be reminded of something I read about this place, or a person that was here before me, or an experience that happened here 200 years before. And to my wife's chagrin, and pretty soon my boys, once they're old enough to get annoyed with Dad, they're going to get real sick of me saying, right here back in 1872, this thing happened and this thing happened, and isn't that cool? And they'll all roll their eyes at me, but I'll be geeking out. And I love those kinds of books that can paint a picture of what made these places what they are, because what they are is incredible, right? Whether that be a wild place, or whether that be just how these areas were populated and communities were built there, whatever it is, it's very, very interesting. Western history and the Western landscape together, I think, are just a fascinating story in so many different ways. So almost with one exception, all of my books are planted in the history of these places, because I think those are the books that are not just most interesting in the moment, but also kind of color my future experiences. So that's a long-winded way of saying, though, Ed, that I will start with my one non-history focused book.
All right.
And this is one of my very favorite books of any genre in any area by one of my very favorite authors and writers in any genre. And this is a classic. This will not be a new book for most listeners, but I can't have a list about my favorite books related to the West without listing Desert Solitaire by Mr. Ed Abbey. I mean, I don't know what can be said about this book or about Abbey that has not been said already, but it is a absolute, almost holy text in a way for anybody who cares about the West and who cares about, taking care of these wild places. I think Abbey was one of our most fiery, passionate, ornery, outspoken disciples of the wild that America has ever produced. And this book, I think, is his single best distillation of, his defense of wilderness. And, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's a series of kind of scattered stories and anecdotes that he compiled out of a series of summers he spent as a ranger at Arches and Canyonlands National Parks there in Utah. And he ends up kind of, some of these chapters are just stories of an experience. Like there's a great chapter about down the river when he floated down the Colorado River, right? I think that was the one when he was going through Glen Canyon before it was flooded. And so he has these stories of various experiences he had, but then throughout many of those stories and anecdotes, he kind of expounds on a number of themes and philosophies he has about the West, about wilderness, about civilization. And out of those, we have, I think, some of our most memorable one-liners or quotes within the conservation and wilderness space. And I don't know, I think also he, more than anybody else, taps into, I don't know what the right word is other than almost rage, or almost, it's a mix of sadness and anger and discontent and worry, but Abbey has a tinge of like the anger more than anybody else, as far as, these things we feel, this sense of loss as these places are chipped away at, as they are taken advantage of, as they are destroyed in one fashion or another. And he, I think so many people connect with him because he uniquely taps into that and kind of says, hey, it's okay to feel this way. It's okay to be pretty pissed off about what's happening. And you shouldn't just be pissed off. You should do something about it too. And he speaks to that in a compelling way. He's got a chapter in the book all about industrial tourism and the national parks, and there's some very interesting stuff in there. And man, I don't know. I read it for the first time. I'm pretty sure I was reading it on a backpacking / camping trip in the Sierra Nevadas, and then I read it again on a camping trip on the edge of the Colorado River through Utah and stuff. And then I've picked it up and read pieces and parts at random other points, but it's one of those books that's always best, for me at least, enjoyed outside or somewhere nearby. And I always come out of it, whether I read a passage or a page or the whole thing, I come out of it re-fired up to do something so that, what my kids are experiencing right now will be available for their kids 30 years from now and their grandkids 30, 40 years down the road further.
I think that's a great summary, and it's funny because I've had a very similar experience with that book. Like the first time I read it, I'd never been to the Southwest, like to Canyonlands or anything, or Arches. And so I read it and I enjoyed it. I was like, this is good. But then I went down there and spent like a week completely by myself in Canyonlands and Arches. And then I reread it after that, and it had a different, more kind of a richer meaning to me. And then I read a book that we talked about in our last conversation, All the Wild That Remains by David Gessner, which is a double biography of Abbey and Stegner. And then I've revisited passages after that, and then it became even richer. And I love books like that where they have different meanings at different, as you have had different life experiences. And I feel like that book is really perfect with that. And another thing I think worth thinking about with it is, since Abbey, there've been, dozens and dozens, if not thousands, of wannabe writers trying to be a version of that guy, but he was the original. And there's been all these people trying, and forms of writing and forms of environmental activism, all based on what he did. And so that book really was just, we kept talking about foundations early, but like that was the foundation of this whole different side of the environmental conservation movement in the West. And everything is kind of built off of that. Like I remember maybe an analogy. I remember the first time I watched The Godfather, I was like, yeah, that's pretty good. But I don't think it's as good as Goodfellas. Right. But Goodfellas was built on The Godfather. Like without The Godfather, there would be no Goodfellas. And so that created this whole genre of movies. And there've been a million like gangster movies since then. They're all pretty good, but they all link back to The Godfather, which is the original. So I think I'm with you on that. I need to, it's been a while since I've read it, but I need to just pick it up and flip through it because it does give you motivation. And I think that anger, I think that's an important part on the spectrum. We can't all be angry and we can't all be willing to tear shit up like he and his cronies were, but I think it is an important part of this. So That's a great one, man. I think that's.
Yeah, you need both sides of that energy. You need that kind of that anger, and then you need the optimism, and you need to somehow find ways to harness both of those in the appropriate moments. And I got to say two things. One, All the Wild That Remains, you mentioned the double biography of Ed and Stegner, is another one of my absolute favorites. And if we hadn't already covered it in our last episode, I would have mentioned it in this one. I love that book. It's such a great intro to Abby, and really, I'm not sure what you should read first. I almost think you should read that before reading Desert Solitaire, because I think then you might appreciate it and get more out of the book. I'm not sure. You should read both. I don't care what order you do it. They're great. And then it's funny, you mentioned how there really hasn't been anyone quite like Abby since Abby. Mm-hmm. And I had a thought, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I feel like one of our closest modern day versions of that, in a very different way, but someone who speaks to the issues in the similar kind of no BS way, is Yvon Chouinard.
Yes.
Like
you're correct. I hadn't thought about that, but you're exactly right.
I think he's our closest analog today of someone who's willing to call it as he sees it and do something about it and be a real spokesperson for this, in a very visceral, unfiltered way. And I think you need somebody like that at every point in history. There's someone like that, and I'm glad we've had a few, because they do make a real difference. My
dream is to get him on the podcast, so if I ever do, I'll ask him how much Abby influenced him.
Yeah,
and I'll credit you with the question.
Okay, that'd be great.
All right, no, that's a great one. All right, the first one that came in my head, and it's the first one that always comes in my head when I'm thinking about books about the American West, is Blood and Thunder, the epic story of Kit Carson and the conquest of the American West by Hampton Sides.
Yeah. And
I think some people, when they listen to my podcast, they think that I've been like obsessed with Western stuff my whole life, or Western history. And it really haven't. It's maybe the last like 12 to 15 years. And I credit Blood and Thunder with being the first book I read that really got me zoned in on Western history and really history in general. And I think I feel like it is about as good as you get when it comes to presenting real serious, detailed, almost academic. I mean, Hampton Sides is not an academic, but academic level history, but put in a package that is so fun to read and so exciting to read. And it's one of these books that, the subtitle has Kit Carson in it, but I think it's equally about the Navajo and about their, first of all, what a badass group of people the Navajo have been. And then it's also about how bad they got screwed over by the U.S. government as we went through the whole Manifest Destiny thing. Kit Carson is a big part of it, but it's almost like Kit Carson is, I've used this analogy before and other people use it all the time, but he's like the Forrest Gump of this area, of this time period, in that like anything important that happened during that time period of the Manifest Destiny expansion of the West, basically the extermination of many native cultures, Kit Carson was at almost every single event. I know that Kit Carson's always had a bit of a mixed reputation. There's no way around it. He's a tough guy, but there are questions about what he did, and he did a lot of bad stuff, as did a lot of people working for the U.S. government back then. But it's a very clear examination of him and his life. I mean, he was married to a Native American woman, but it's just all these different people that you've heard about, like John C. Fremont or James Henry Carleton, all these just interesting people that you've probably heard about in passing but don't know much about. Hampton Sides really profiles them. And I think the magic of this book, and it really helped me as I was doing my podcast, is that I learned that you can make the most boring history in the world very exciting and very fun if you just focus on people. And I feel like that's what Hampton does in all of his books. He does a lot of World War I books, World War II books, the Korean War, and it's almost like each chapter, each paragraph is a mini biography of some interesting person, and then he weaves them all together into this really cool narrative. And when you're all done, you've learned about this important part of history. Yeah. And so I feel like Blood and Thunder is a masterclass in storytelling. It's a masterclass in narrative history. It gives you this base level of knowledge about the American Southwest and about the Navajo. And there's a passage in here, and I'm going to try to read it real quick, at the very beginning, talking about the Navajo. And I think it's, if you don't know anything about Navajo, reading the first few chapters of Blood and Thunder will give you a real appreciation. But it's talking about them and what a unique tribe they are, and it's talking about their origin story, which is called the Emergence. And so he says, the Emergence captures much that is unique about the Navajo, their sense of having been wandering in exile through most of their early history, perpetual outsiders expelled from one country after another, forced to compete in a complicated series of journeys through strange dark lands until they finally lit on the glittering world, as they called their present home. Their tendency to view themselves as a tribe apart from the others, a kind of chosen people of the Southwest, convinced their special relationship to the gods and confident in the power of their rituals, and yet simultaneously a tribe eager to absorb the ideas and implements of others, to mingle with other people. If the Navajo indulged in a tribal pride that bordered on arrogance, it was an arrogance cut with an extraordinary impulse to accept other traditions, a natural ease for ushering in new ways and even new blood. And then the next paragraph starts with, in a sense, the Navajo were the most, quote, American of the American Indians. And I thought that I'd never thought about that before, but how they, in a way, the Navajo were exactly what the first American settlers were. They're kind of outcasts from other countries coming together and inventing their own thing, but borrowing things. And so don't let the subtitle fool you on this book. If you don't care about Kit Carson, I mean, he's an interesting dude to learn about, but there's a lot more in this book, and I'd say it's my number one favorite book. So, have you read that?
I have read that, and I agree. Great book, fascinating story, fascinating history, great characters that really kind of add color to the history. I think one of the superpowers of what he's done there is there's one, you can tell a historical story, but it's always more interesting and personal and easier to follow if you're actually following a person too, right? Like having character, right? Character development, character narrative. I mean, that's why fiction is so great, right? If you can pull that into nonfiction, you've got a great opportunity, and he does that really well. Another one that's pretty similar is Empire of the Summer Moon. Have you read that one?
Yeah, that's a very good one. Yeah.
So they kind of do something similar. This is S.C. Gwynn, and he shares kind of a similar story, but what happens in the kind of central South, like Texas, Oklahoma area, with the Comanche tribe and the numerous atrocities that the United States military committed during that whole period, but all the back and forth and the stuff that goes on there, and then a character named Quanah Parker, who was a son of a white settler who became a Comanche chief. And so that was a very interesting, another angle of kind of a similar story that adds color to a difficult but interesting period in our history as well. And I would add, we're going to have like 20 books by the end of this.
I know, that's what I was thinking. My man Sam that edits these things and compiles the notes, he's going to say, I'm sorry, you got a lot of work cut out for you here, buddy.
Yeah, I know. But I found after reading that book you mentioned, but then reading this Empire of the Summer Moon and getting this better backdrop for understanding the history of the Southwest and the back and forth between settlers and Native Americans, that made reading another book by Cormac McCarthy called Blood Meridian really, really interesting. And that is a totally different kind of book.
That.
Oh, you haven't?
No, it's unacceptable that I haven't read it.
Yeah, I mean, it is dark. It is bizarre in certain ways. I need to read. I've only read it once. It's a book, though, that you need to go back and read multiple times to really understand what it is you're reading. And is this real? Is this allegory? Is this... But it's haunting more than anything. It's haunting. And so that's like a fictional story that takes place across this same landscape at that time, and it gives you a very interesting window into what it might have been like. A brutal time, but a very interesting read, especially if you just read those two books to get a historical sense of the time and the real life what happened, and then take a step in this person's shoes in this book, Blood Meridian, and step foot into that time and that place. I think is a very interesting way to explore that region through a couple books.
Every time we talk, there are these books that I know I need to read that I haven't read, like The Overstory. I mean, it's unexpected.
Come on, Ed. I just saw you posting about that the other day. I thought you were going to finally take the leap.
I took it with me on vacation for a week, and I still didn't read it. I don't know what my problem is. All right, this will be good. You're sternly forcing me to read the books I need to read. All right, what do you got next?
All right, so I will, for the sake of time, I will take two books and tack them together, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Because they tie in really well to what we've just been discussing a little bit, right? We've mentioned two different historical narratives around kind of the exploration of the Southwest and interactions with Native American tribes and whatnot. And there's two books that I really like that tackle a similar thing, but a much wider scope. And they do it in two different ways. So one of these books is The Course of Empire by Bernard DeVoto. Who's a legendary Western writer, was a huge influence on Wallace Stegner, as anyone who read All the Wild That Remains would know. And this is one of the most compelling, deep history books I've read, really about anything, let alone the West. But this is the story, basically, of the beginning of westward expansion across the North American continent, starting like when the Spanish first landed and started exploring all through. So we hear everything from Florida heading west, from Mexico heading north and west, as well as then, the French coming in the north and their explorations up the various rivers, trapping, exploring, yada, yada, yada. You hear this story of the westward exploration all the way up until Lewis and Clark. And it ends after Lewis and Clark's expedition. But there's no other book I've read that covers that very, very wide swath. There's a whole lot that happens in between those 2 points. Nothing I've read has covered that vast, both terrain and time, right? This is like a timeline of, I don't know, from the hundreds of years. This is hundreds of years covered in one single book, but doing it in a way that is not horrible to read. It's pretty darn interesting. There's times where it gets like dense a little bit. Yeah. And this is the denser of the two options I'm going to present to folks, but it really gives you a really good foundation for any other Western history, for any Western story, for Western culture. Even today, this book really describes the foundation and those moments, those kind of crescendos within that several 100-year period, which laid the groundwork for these places that we love now. So highly recommend that one. But that one is a book that it really gets into the details, and it gets into a lot. So if that is the kind of thing you're into, definitely read The Course of Empire. And it's the first of a 3-book trilogy I'll mention. The second book covers the kind of the heyday of the beaver trappers and the mountain men, 1810 through 1830 or 40, something like that. And that's called Across the Wide Missouri. And then the third one is called, I think it's The Year of Decision or something like that. And that's more focused on settlers coming out, the Oregon Trail, that period of time. Highly recommend that. If, though, that sounds intimidating to you and you're interested in a little bit more breezy of a read, another book which covers a similar swath of history, plus it goes a little bit further, would be Dreams of Eldorado by
I've seen that one
Brands.
and it caught my attention right when it came out. And so it's pretty good, huh?
Yeah, and I mean, the critique on this one is that it doesn't go deep enough into any one thing. So people have said, it's too surface level. But if somebody wanted to get a sweeping view of some key events in Western American history, this would probably be my first recommendation because it covers almost all of the big points, and it covers it in a way that is not too difficult to get through. It's a relatively easy read. It covers a lot of like big important things that are kind of like the punctuation marks across this hundreds of year long journey, and does it in a way that's breezy, it's fun to read, good storytelling, and it won't bog you down too much. So it starts, with the core of discovery, right? Lewis and Clark. So it begins kind of where the course of empire ends. So you could almost read these together. So it begins with that first exploration across the West by Lewis and Clark, and then you get into subsequent groups of trappers that came across. You learn a little bit about some of like the groups, like the Astoria Party, who explored all the way to the ocean and various things that happened there that I never knew about. It covers some of the mountain man history as well. It does a lot as far as Texas, what goes on during that whole back and forth war for Texas and independence, and a lot of interesting things that happen down there. It goes into some of the stuff like we talked about with the Comanches and various Native American issues and things that happened. Then there's a section that's all about that, the whole mass movement in the 1850s, 60s, as really Western settlement ramped up. So the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, all of that. You hear a lot about that kind of stuff. You get into the gold rush. Now we're like into the 70s and 80s of the 1800s. So you learn all about that period of time. And then it even gets into like the railroads as the railroads started being built across the country, how that changed things as you go into the latter part of the 1800s, the demise of the buffalo, and even kind of like the cowboy stage, right? When all that kind of starts happening. So you get, it mostly covers that 100-year period from the beginning of the 1800s to the end. I think it ends right towards the end. I think it probably ends right when they were calling the frontier closed, right? Which I think the year was I can't remember what it was. But that's what Dreams of Eldorado is. It's a great entryway, I think, into this topic, and it does it in a way that I think most people could get through it and find it pretty interesting. Some of these others might be, like The Course of Empire, might be a little harder. So those are two great Western history books that will give you a sweeping and thorough examination of some key events that kind of led us to where we are. So those together would be a heck of a start for anybody that wants that wide view of what happened here.
Those are awesome. And one thing I thought was interesting about our list, when we were doing the conservation books, I think we had each read 4 of the others 5. And in these, I've only read 1 of your 5. So I have not read either of these. And I've never read anything by Brands. And my computer here is actually propped up by his thick, massive, basically 1,000-page biography of Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh, yeah.
But I didn't know if that book, I for some reason, I just had the idea that book went really deep into and I thought it was going to be too dense. And so I love books like that, kind of wide ranging, kind of like sprawling histories over a big period of time, because as I was saying earlier, that gives me this kind of base level of information, and then I can figure out what part I'm really interested in and then dig into very specific books. So that sounds awesome to me. And then the Devoto book, that is funny because the podcast just before this one that I published was with Nate Schweber, who published a biography of Devoto and his wife Avis called This America of Ours. And that, I just wasn't familiar. I'd heard you talk about him. I knew you were a fan of his work. I've heard like David Gessner talk about him. He comes up, but I just didn't know much about him. And he was a unbelievably interesting guy. had a bit of that anger that they were talking about with Abby. And I think there was he influenced Stegner directly. I mean, Stegner was a disciple of Devoto. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to try to read some Devoto, some of his work, because this book got me so interested in him. It was just really a blank spot in my brain. But you do such a good job in your book of talking about FDR's conservation legacy. And that was where I really learned about that. But I think Devoto kind of picked up after FDR and was really the force of conservation I'd say he was probably the main force of conservation from between FDR and the modern, LBJ, during that time period when there was a lot of modern day environmental conservation legislation. And so those are both awesome, and they're both books that I do need to read. My list is getting too long here, man.
It's a problem when we get together, Ed.
Yeah. All right, my next one. We actually had a bit of a tug of war over this one because we both like it, but The Emerald Mile by Kevin Fedarko.
Great book.
And I'll tell you, I'm kind of, I realized when I was putting my book list together that because of my podcast, it's like a dream come true. I get to I've gotten to know a lot of these authors, and I've gotten to spend time with them. And so that influences how much I like the book, because I mean, really 100% of the time, all the authors that I've gotten to know that I admire, they're also really cool people and good people, and you included in that. And so it really does kind of make me like their books even more. And that's how it is with Kevin Fedarko. I feel like his book, when I first read it, it was before I was doing the podcast or anything. And in a way, it's very similar to Hampton Sides, which makes sense because they worked together at Outside Magazine. Hampton was an editor there, and Kevin has written for Outside for a very long time. And it's a history book with a lot of detail and a lot of information, but fit into this pretty wild adventure story. And so Emerald Mile, the overview, the subtitle may be the longest subtitle I've ever seen: the epic story of the fastest ride in history through the heart of the Grand Canyon. And that's what it's about. These crazy river guides who, during one of the most flooded years in the Grand Canyon history, decide they're going to try to paddle down the Grand Canyon the fastest that anybody's ever done it. And so that's kind of the framework for the story. But along the way, Kevin gives you info on everything from Coronado's early explorations of the Southwest to the beginnings of the Bureau of Reclamation and how all these dams came to be in the first place. And like Blood and Thunder, it's one of these books that you read it, and without even knowing it, you walk away with a ton of history and understanding about the West, everything from the early settlement to the current water crisis in the West. Like, if you want to, everybody's hearing about the Colorado River and what bad shape it's in. If you want to understand kind of how we got to that point, but you don't want to go into some boring water law kind of stuff, which is very boring, read The Emerald Mile, because you'll have fun. It's like watching an awesome movie, but you'll understand how we got to this place that we are with water in the West. And so I just absolutely love that book. I need to read it again. And two notes on it. The version I have is a paperback, and in the back there's a kind of a Q&A with Kevin where he answers questions about the book, and that gives you a little more insight into how he wrote it. But if you look at the bibliography, it is insane how many sources this guy. I mean, like I said, the story is so easy to read and so fun. It just kind of goes right into your brain and you enjoy it. But if you look at how many sources he had to go through and the amount of research, and just in my limited time hanging around with Kevin, he is a very serious and very almost like a scholarly writer. And he's very, very serious about all of it. And when you see how much work goes into this end product that's such a fun read, it gives you even more respect for what he's doing. And so I can't recommend it enough. And, if you read The Emerald Mile and you love it and you want to go a little deeper in that world, you can read Beyond the 100th Meridian by Wallace Stegner, which gives you more info on water in the West. There's a book called Downriver by Heather Hansman, who's been on my podcast. That's a good one. Cadillac Desert. There are a million ways you can go, but if you just want something fun that you're going to learn, Emerald Mile is the way to go.
Yeah. I agree. And it was my first one I've read that really opened my eyes to the water issues in the West back when I first picked it up, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. And yeah, highly recommend it. I also found there to be some parts in there that I thought really beautifully made a case for wild places and wild rivers and wilderness, especially the character Martin Litton, or Litton, I think Litton. He was the owner of the rafting company, I think, down there that they kind of profiled a bit. And he had an outsized impact on trying to protect the Grand Canyon. And he was another great example of someone during that era, the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, who, kind of larger than life characters who helped save these places as best as possible. So yeah, I'm going to second that one. That was on my list too. So great book.
And one other note on that, Kevin did this great book, and then Pete McBride, who's been on my podcast a few times, he did a documentary film called Into the Canyon. I think it's on Disney Plus with National Geographic. And in that documentary, Pete and Kevin hike the length of the Grand Canyon inside the canyon. And it takes them they do it over the course of a year. But that's a really good way to kind of, if you read Emerald Mile and you like it and you're like, who is this Kevin Fedorko guy? Watch that documentary, because it gives you some insight into his personality and his love for the Southwest and his love for conservation. And it's also funny to see him and Kevin and Pete kind of play off each other, because Kevin's very serious and very calm, and Pete's wild and kind of crazy. And Pete says that he is the Tigger to Kevin Fedorko's Eeyore. So I would, if you want to watch something this good, even my 7-year-old daughter liked it. So yeah, great book all the way around. Yeah, it's really good. 2 hours.
Looks like a good one. So I'm next, huh?
Yep.
So I will tell you that my next book is, again, history focused, but the most fun, I think, of the history books here. It's the book called The Oregon Trail by Buck Rinker. And anyone who's interested in that period of history in the West and that region, this would be my first recommendation to read, because it is just a really good time. Have you read A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson?
Yeah, I loved it. I read it a long time ago. I loved it.
Yeah, so great book. The Oregon Trail is like a walk in the woods, but for the Oregon Trail. If the walk in the woods is like the story of the Appalachian Trail and the history, while told through someone's hike of that trail, right? Bryson does this great job, funny story. Well, the same thing happens here with the Oregon Trail. Buck decides that he wants to learn about the Oregon Trail more, and so he builds a wagon and gets mules and rides across the country with mules and a covered wagon, and basically simulates as best as you possibly can in the modern day what the Oregon Trail was like, following the actual trail as close as he possibly could across the country. And it's very funny. Just like A Walk in the Woods, there's like a character dynamic between like the straight man, which is the main character and the writer, and like a goofy partner. So there's a lot of humor in it, and the history is seamless as well. So it's, I know both of you really enjoy these kinds of books where you get to follow a real life modern day adventure, but then you also learn about something along the way. Well, that's done in a masterful way with this book. So it's a easy, digestible book. It's something that I could give to, even someone who doesn't traditionally love history books, and they'll enjoy the ride, but they're going to learn a lot along the way. So, definitely recommend the Oregon Trail. It has colored my travels across I-80 and going across the country in a much different way now after reading that. And it gives you a much deeper dive. Even though several of the books I mentioned, touch on that era, this one obviously goes the deepest, tells the most interesting stories, really paints a picture for you. So fascinating book.
That when I first saw that, people have told me about that now that I know what it is. But when you sent me that one, I thought that it was going to be some kind of like diaries from some a settler from who rode the Oregon Trail. I was like, man, this guy's getting into like first, into primary sources here. I said, this is serious history. And I was like, I couldn't read that. And then I looked it up on the computer, and it looks hilarious. Like, I love funny books like that. I love Bill Bryson. I think I think he's a brilliant writer, but he's also extremely hilarious. And from reading the reviews and the summary and hearing your summary, that sounds like the exact kind of book I'd want to read, because I don't know much at all about the Oregon Trail. And I think in some ways I've never been able to find a book that seems like it'd be really fun to read about it. And so that put it back to the top of the list, because anything compared to Bill Bryson, I'm all about it. So that's awesome, man. I'll definitely check that one out.
It's a really fun one.
So my next one, speaking of hilarious, one of my favorite authors, a guy named David Gessner, who I talk about all the time and who we've already mentioned him once. Mm-hmm. And this is his book called Leave It As It Is. And I have to have a Theodore Roosevelt book in here. And so this is the Theodore Roosevelt book. But what I love about this, I've read every kind of TR book you can imagine. And but what I love about this is two things. One is Gessner gives a real clear-eyed view of Theodore Roosevelt. This book was published in August of 2020, which was really a peak of when society was rightfully trying to examine these kind of old white dudes from the past and examine their role in the world and the worldviews that they had, and how a lot of those worldviews don't mesh well with the our modern society. But I feel like Gessner in this book, he gives just a really, really good overview of TR, both the good and the bad. What he did that was not great for Native communities, but everything he did that was great for public lands. And then, as Gessner does in his books, and as a lot of great writers do in their book, it's based on a road trip that he did throughout the West, kind of examining TR's impact on public lands. And a lot of the book revolves around the Bears Ears controversy, and how that national monument was kind of the centerpiece for a big fight over public lands. And one of the things I really appreciate about this book is TR. Gessner talks about biography as this a way to learn from people, and you can use what you learn in biographies, and you take the best of a person and you discard the worst, and try to live your life off of what you've learned of the best of these people. And that's what he does about TR. But he also says that Bears Ears is kind of an example of that, because it takes the best of the United States public lands and national parks and national monument system, which some people refer to as America's best idea, and it combines it with some of the best ideas from Native American communities around spirituality, around collaboration, around working with other people, and it combines those two into this national monument that is Bears Ears. And he calls it a confluence of conservation ideals. Just a funny book. Gessner inserts himself into a lot of it, and he's hilarious. And I really like everything he's written, and I like TR, and I like public lands. And so this is your book, if that's for you.
An interesting thing about that book is, more so than many of the other TR books that have come out in the past, David took a little bit of a tougher eye to TR's legacy, right? He was willing to confront some of his failings, some of his weak spots, some of his mistakes, which I thought, was, and he did it in a way where he also was open about his kind of hero worship almost of Theodore Roosevelt, right? He had this like preconceived set of notions and beliefs and interest in Roosevelt. And the deeper he went, he also learned that, there's 1,000 shades of gray to everybody and everyone's legacy, right? And I thought David did a really good job of exploring that, and I think in an appropriate way, like recognizing that this person was not perfect and that everything they did was not perfect, while also saying that doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that you have to destroy everything he did because of some things that weren't just right. I thought that was handled really well, and I think serves as a strong example for how we can examine some other historical figures and periods, in addition to just TRs. Completely
agree. Yeah, I completely agree. And there's another good book called Theodore Roosevelt, The Strenuous Life by Kathleen Dalton that I've since reading Gessner's book. And it does a really good job of showing the pros and the cons of Theodore Roosevelt and how he was not this superhero that a lot of people think. So yeah. I could go on. We should do just a whole episode about Theodore Roosevelt.
That'd be fun. I like that.
All right, what's next?
So my next one, and this is my last one since I kind of combined two together, My last book is called Great Plains by Ian Fraser. Have you read this one?
No, I have not, but I looked it up and it looks awesome.
Yeah, this is a classic. This is a really, really good one. And I haven't read it in a long time, so this made me want to pick it up and read it again. So Ian is a longtime writer for the New Yorker, and a bunch of things like that. So just a tremendous, tremendous writer. I think I got this recommendation from Steve Ranella back when I first met him, and we were talking about the most important books that he'd recommend, and this was one of those. And so I ended up reading this on an elk hunting trip in Idaho, 10, 11 years ago, something like that. And again, we're exploring some of the history of the region. In particular, of course, as the title would indicate, this focuses on the history of the Great Plains, but more so than the history side of this thing, this documents a real-life trip by the author, numerous trips across the Great Plains. I think he said here over the course of 2 years or something, he drove more than 25,000 miles across the Great Plains from Montana to Texas and all points in between, exploring the modern day region. So the book is this very interesting juxtaposition of what are the Great Plains today and how did they get this way. So we're comparing and contrasting what these places are like now, and then wondering why are they like this now, and what catalyzed this place to become what it is now. And then we kind of drop into various little vignettes and stories, whether it be some of the things we talked about, like the Lewis and Clark expedition, or Western settlement, or conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans, or I think there's even a bit in here about like the murders from that book In Cold Blood that happened in Kansas.
There is. I saw that in the summary of the book when I was looking it up.
So it goes from the 1800s well into almost into modern times, exploring interesting stories, interesting characters, but really more than anything, it paints one of the most compelling pictures I've read about what the Great Plains are now today, both physically, topographically, culturally, what the trajectory for this region is into the future, and kind of the great emptying of this place, right? And it was relatively low. It was populated by Native Americans, and the settlers came across and started populating it to a higher degree. And there was kind of a boom during a certain period of time, and then it's actually been, declining now for many years since. And that story and why that's happened is explored as well, which is interesting. And I think he just does a really good job of putting you in these wide open, dusty vistas in a way that both maybe inspires you to want to see them, but also in a gritty, real kind of way paints the not always pretty picture of what it's like out there too. So yeah, he's a tremendous writer, and it's an interesting story both in the modern day time period that he covers as well as the historical elements too. So it's definitely a different feel than the others. It's not like the funny hunky-dory story that the Oregon Trail is, and it's not the comprehensive history that the Course of Empire or Dreams of Eldorado is. But if you want a great vignette and like a taste, more than any of these other books, I think you really get a taste of the place, a sense of the essence of the place that I think is uniquely well done. So The Great Plains, terrific book, a great, particularly good example of like how you can write this kind of book. It's something that I have wanted to go back and look at as a model almost for how I want to write books in the future too. So, really good one.
That sounds great, and then that links directly into one of my other ones, which is a book called Badlands by Jonathan Rabin. I think that's how you say his name, Raban. And this is basically a book about the settlement of eastern Montana. And Rabin is a British guy, and so it's cool because it gives you a little bit of a outsider's perspective. He's not kind of caught up in the myth of it like the average American is. He's an outsider looking in. And he describes he's a really good writer, almost like a lyrical writer. I mean, I'd say it reads in some ways like a novel would be written more than a nonfiction book. But he kind of focuses in on this time period in the settlement of eastern Montana. I think it was they called it the Enlarged Homestead Act, when the U.S. government was really wanted people to move out west. And so they upped the amount of land you would get from 160 acres to 320 acres. And for $16, and if you plowed it up and paid $16, it was yours for free. And it talks about just really how the U.S. government went about trying to convince people to move out there. And even at 320 acres, that's not enough land to make a go of it in the West. And there was a scene in the book I remember, and I was looking it up before we started recording to try to find it, but I couldn't find the quote. But he talks about when these people, these immigrants and poor people from the East Coast are moving out west to stake their claim in eastern Montana, and how excited they are. And they're just, happy and excited, and they're fired up because they're going out to stake their claim. And he compared it to the young soldiers in World War I, American soldiers being psyched up and excited to go to war and beat up the bad guys, but then they end up in the trenches and in trench warfare where they end up dead on barbed wire. And he compares these poor people moving to the West the same way, like they don't know what's waiting for them. And it's really a kind of a disturbing story in some ways, because you see kind of how dishonest a lot of the marketing was around getting people to move out west. And you see what a harsh landscape it is, and almost a disorienting landscape. These people moving from Scotland or England, and next thing you know, they're in the middle of the wide open prairie. But I just picked the book up on a whim because I think I like the cover, and it's one of these things that I constantly am thinking back to. So highly recommend that one. And then my last one is a author that I had on the podcast a while back, recently, Betsy Gaines Quammen, and it's called American Zion. And it, in another way, is kind of a disturbing look at the settlement of the West. And it's a discussion and a history of the Mormon settlement of the West. And it's not like John Krakauer's book, Under the Banner of Heaven, which is pretty rough on Mormons. And it's, if I were a Mormon, I probably wouldn't like that book. But Betsy has a lot of Mormon friends who have read the book and gave her kudos for her great work on this book. But it starts with the Mormons movement across the United States, and it goes all the way up to a subject you know a lot about from your writing work, the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and the current battles over public lands. And so it's one of those books, again, that links the history, which can sometimes be dark and confusing and nuanced, but it lays this foundation that allows you to understand where we are now. And so Betsy and I talked about that book for an hour, and so I'll link to that podcast and you can hear directly from her about it. But it was such a surprise to read. People have been telling me for a year that I needed to read it, and I had not. And then when I picked it up, I just loved it. And it, again, kind of like the Bernard DeVoto book I mentioned, it. There's this blank spot in my understanding of the history of the West, and American Zion filled that in. And so thoroughly like that, thoroughly enjoyed Badlands. I mean, all these books, and we could keep talking for another 3 hours and still not even get through a fraction of them. Yeah, man, this is, I love doing this with you. And it gets me kind of hyped up because I need to be reading more. I need to be reading all this stuff.
Got homework to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this, man. And good luck with the travels and with hunting season. I look forward to following along.
Thank you.
Anything else you want to wrap it up with?
No, I thoroughly enjoyed it as well. I love geeking out about these books. I'm glad there's a kindred spirit over there in Colorado, and I know I can get a hold of you and get some good recommendations. So this is a great time, and we're gonna have to think of another theme and tackle something again another 6 months from now or something like that.
Yeah, once you're recovered from hunting season, we'll regroup and do it again. But thanks, man. Be safe. Be safe during hunting season.
Same to you, Ed. Thank you.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. 1 email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.